My name is Daniel, and I'm 32 years old. For the past 8 years, I've worked in the same company, climbing my way up from a low-level assistant to a mid-level project coordinator. I know some people might say I should have jumped ship for better opportunities, but I always thought loyalty meant something in the workplace. I thought if I kept my head down, worked hard, and put in the hours, someone up there would notice. Someone would reward my dedication. But instead, what I got was a boss who seemed to make it his personal mission to remind me every single day that I was useless. From the moment he walked in, things changed. His name was Richard, though he insisted we call him Mr. Harris. He wasn't just the type to demand respect, he demanded submission. He was in his early 50s, but he carried himself like he was still in his prime. Sharp suits, expensive watches, that arrogant swagger. But behind all of it was a man who thrived on belittling others. "Daniel," he said on his very first week, his voice dripping with disdain, "you look like the kind of guy who takes longer to figure things out. Don't slow me down." That line stuck with me. He didn't even know me, yet he had already placed me into the box he wanted me in. The box of incompetence, weakness, and failure. And for months, he made sure I never forgot it. Before I continue with this story, I just want to say, if you've ever dealt with someone who abused their power at work, then you know how much it eats away at your self-worth. And if you've been in a situation like this, tell me where you're watching from in the comments, and join this growing community where justice is always served. Because here, no betrayal goes unanswered, and no bully gets the last word. But back to Richard. It wasn't just me he treated poorly. Everyone in the office feared him. He had this way of turning casual mistakes into public humiliations. If someone missed a deadline by even a day, he would call them into the center of the open office and say things like, "Ladies and gentlemen, here's what failure looks like." People laughed nervously, but no one dared to stand up to him. For me, it was worse. He singled me out more than anyone else. If my email had a typo, he'd forward it to the entire department with the subject line, "Our resident genius at work." If I presented an idea in a meeting, he'd cut me off mid-sentence, saying, "Don't waste our time, Daniel. We need real solutions, not whatever this is." At first, I tried to brush it off. I told myself that maybe he was just trying to push me harder. Maybe this was some twisted version of mentorship. But as the weeks turned into months, I realized it was something far darker. Richard thrived on control. He fed off our fear. And he had built his entire career not on hard work or intelligence, but on intimidation and manipulation. The breaking point came one Friday afternoon. I was the last one in the office, wrapping up some reports for Monday's meeting. Richard walked in, clearly drunk, his tie loosened and his eyes bloodshot. He slammed a folder on my desk and said, "You think you're useful, Daniel? You're not. You're just taking up space." He laughed bitterly, then leaned in closer. "You're lucky I haven't found a way to fire you yet. But don't worry, I will." That night, something shifted inside me. For the first time, I wasn't just angry. I was determined. See, Richard wasn't just a bad boss. He was reckless. He left trails. I had seen him accept envelopes from clients under the table. I had heard whispers about expense reports that didn't add up. And I had once overheard him on the phone making arrangements that had nothing to do with business but everything to do with personal gain. I realized that maybe, just maybe, Richard wasn't as untouchable as he thought. So I began to pay closer attention. I started documenting everything. Every insult, every belittling email, every suspicious meeting he had outside the office. I copied files, took photos, and kept notes. It wasn't easy. I had to play the part of the beaten-down employee, pretending to be submissive while secretly building a case against him. But day by day, my evidence grew stronger. There was one incident that stood out. A vendor called me, furious because they had been charged twice for a service. When I looked into it, I realized the second invoice had been redirected to Richard's personal account. That was embezzlement, plain and simple. And that was when I knew I had something that could destroy him. But it wasn't enough to know. I had to act. And that's when I contacted a lawyer friend of mine, someone I trusted. I showed him the documents I had collected, and his eyes widened. "Daniel, do you realize what you have here?" he asked. "This isn't just unethical. This is criminal." Hearing those words gave me a rush of power I hadn't felt in years. For the first time since Richard had stepped into our office, I felt like the scales were tipping in my favor. But I wasn't reckless. I couldn't just storm into HR or confront him directly. I needed this to be airtight, undeniable. So I kept collecting, kept observing, kept waiting for the perfect moment. And then it happened. Richard scheduled a huge company-wide meeting for the end of the quarter. He wanted to show off his leadership and take credit for our team's hard work. He strutted around the office that week like a king preparing for his coronation. And that's when I decided it was time. I made a quiet call, handed over the files to the right people, and sat back. I didn't know exactly what would happen or when, but I knew it was only a matter of time before Richard's empire of arrogance came crashing down. Little did I know, the way it would unfold was beyond anything I could have imagined. The morning of the big quarterly meeting arrived, and the office was buzzing with nervous energy. Richard had hyped it up for weeks, talking about how he was going to present his achievements to the board and secure his next promotion. Everyone knew the meeting was more about his ego than the company's performance, but no one dared to say it out loud. I remember sitting at my desk that morning, heart pounding, my carefully prepared documents already in the hands of the right people. I had done my part. All I could do now was wait. Richard walked into the office dressed in one of his most expensive suits, a deep navy with a matching tie, and his smug grin stretched from ear to ear. He looked around the room, soaking in the fear and silence, and said, "Today, ladies and gentlemen, you'll see why I'm the best damn leader this company has ever had." The arrogance in his voice made my stomach turn, but at the same time, it fueled me. I knew his downfall was just around the corner. The meeting began in the large conference room. Richard stood at the head of the table, clicking through slides that highlighted profits and contracts, most of which he had nothing to do with. He talked over everyone, shut down questions, and made sure to belittle anyone who dared to interrupt his self-congratulation. But then, midway through his speech, something happened. The glass doors of the conference room swung open. 2 uniformed officers stepped inside, followed by a man in a suit who looked like an investigator. The room went dead silent. Richard froze, his mouth still half open from whatever lie he had just been telling. "Richard Harris?" one of the officers said firmly. Richard blinked. "Yes. You're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and misuse of company funds." The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, like a crack in the dam, whispers started spreading around the table. Richard laughed nervously. "This is a mistake. I don't know what you think you're doing, but I'm in the middle of an important meeting." But the officers didn't flinch. One of them stepped forward, producing handcuffs. "Sir, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." And right there, in front of the entire company, his employees, his superiors, and the very board members he was trying to impress, Richard Harris was cuffed and escorted out of the room. His face turned from arrogance to desperation, then to rage. As they walked him past my seat, our eyes met. His glare was venomous, but beneath it, I saw fear. Real fear. The kind of fear he had forced us to feel for months. Now it was his turn. The moment the doors closed behind him, the room erupted. Some people gasped, others whispered furiously, and a few even laughed in disbelief. For the first time, the power dynamic in our office shifted. The monster who had ruled over us with insults and intimidation was gone. Later that day, HR and upper management called an emergency meeting. They assured us that Richard's actions had been fully exposed thanks to an anonymous tip with supporting documents. They didn't name me, of course, but I knew. I knew it was my evidence that had torn down his empire. And here's where the twist comes in. With Richard gone, the company needed someone to step up and take over the projects he had abandoned. Someone reliable. Someone who knew the work inside and out. And guess whose name kept coming up? Mine. I was promoted within weeks. It wasn't just a small step up, it was a leap. Suddenly, the same people who had watched Richard belittle me were looking at me with respect. I wasn't useless anymore. I was essential. Months later, I heard that Richard had tried to fight the charges, but the evidence was stacked too high. Between the fraudulent invoices, the misused funds, and the testimonies of vendors he had wronged, there was no escape. He ended up serving time, his career destroyed, his reputation in ruins. And me? I finally understood something I should have realized long ago. Loyalty means nothing to the wrong people. It's not about how much you give, it's about who you give it to. And when someone abuses their power, the best revenge isn't anger, or shouting, or stooping to their level. The best revenge is patience, evidence, and timing. So, am I the asshole for getting my boss arrested at work? Maybe some people would say yes, that I should have just quit, or ignored it, or let someone else deal with it. But the way I see it, I didn't just get revenge for myself. I stood up for everyone in that office who had suffered under his reign. And honestly, watching him walk out of that conference room in handcuffs, that was the sweetest justice I've ever seen.